The gavel hovered in the auctioneer's hand like a verdict waiting to be delivered. Rain tapped against the tin roof of the community hall, and the smell of wet wool and old coffee hung heavy in the air. Rows of folding chairs held the town's usual faces, contractors hunting for bargains, retirees killing a Saturday, and the Whitmore family, seated up front in coats that cost more than most people's cars. Nobody was here for the cottage. It sat last on the docket, photographed from an unflattering angle, its roof caved in on one side like a tired shoulder. The listing called it a fixer-upper. Everyone in the room knew that was generous. "Lot 14, the auctioneer said, barely masking his boredom. "Cottage and quarter-acre off Miller's Creek Road. Do I hear an opening bid?" Silence. A cough. Someone's chair creaked. In the back row, Claire Bennett sat with her hands folded tight in her lap, knuckles pale. 6 months ago, she had a house, a marriage, a name people said with respect. Now she had a motel room paid week to week, and a bank account that flinched at the word withdrawal. She hadn't planned to bid on anything. She'd only come in from the cold. But something about that broken little roof, abandoned, written off, not worth anyone's time, pulled at her like a mirror. $1, she said. The room turned. A ripple of laughter moved through the folding chairs, sharp and unkind. Somewhere near the front, Margaret Whitmore's mouth curled into something just short of a smile, exchanging a glance with her son that Claire wasn't meant to catch, but did. "Going once," the auctioneer said, fighting a grin of his own. "Going twice." Nobody else raised a hand. Why would they? "Sold to the lady in the back for $1. The laughter followed her all the way to the folding table where she signed the paperwork, hands trembling, unsure if she'd just made the worst decision of her life or the only good one she had left. 3 years ago, Claire Bennett had a life people envied without ever saying so out loud. A husband with a steady paycheck, a house with a porch swing she'd painted herself, a name that opened doors in a town where names mattered more than money. Then David got sick, and the paycheck stopped, and the house went to the bank in pieces, first the equity, then the deed, then the porch swing she never got to take with her. He died on a Tuesday in March, quietly, the way he'd done most things in his life. Claire buried him on a Friday and moved into a motel by the following week. Grief, she learned, was patient. It didn't demand anything of you right away. It simply waited in every silence, every empty chair, every time she reached for a phone to call someone who could no longer answer. The town had been kind, in the way small towns are, kind to tragedy. A casserole here, a sympathetic nod there, but kindness had a shelf life, and pity curdled fast into something closer to distance. People stopped asking how she was doing. They stopped inviting her to things. She became a name mentioned in hushed tones at the market, a cautionary tale whispered over coffee. Meanwhile, the Whitmores expanded. New storefronts downtown, a wing added to the hospital with their name carved above the door. Margaret Whitmore rarely walked anywhere in town without someone stopping to shake her hand, thank her, orbit her like she was the sun. Claire understood. The difference between them wasn't talent, or work, or worth. It was simply the direction the wind had blown. So when she raised her hand at that auction and said $1, it wasn't really about the cottage at all. It was about proving, to herself, if no one else, that she could still choose something, that she could still stand in a room and claim a piece of the world, however broken, however small, and call it hers, even if everyone around her was laughing. Word traveled faster than Claire expected, the way it always did in a town small enough to fit its gossip into a single afternoon. By Monday, the story had a life of its own. At the diner on Main Street, she caught 2 waitresses trading a look over the coffee pot, a look followed by a laugh they didn't bother to hide. "Heard the Bennett woman bought a $1 house," one of them said, not quite quiet enough. "Guess that's about what it's worth." On the community Facebook page, Someone posted a photo of the cottage's caved-in roof with the caption, "Congratulations to the newest homeowner in town." 3 laughing emojis, 42 comments, most of them cruel, in the polite, small-town way that never used a person's name, but everyone understood anyway. Even Denise, who had once been her closest friend, stopped her outside the pharmacy with the sympathetic tilt of the head that Claire had learned to dread. "You could have asked for help, you know. You didn't have to do something so desperate." Claire smiled and said she was fine. She was getting good at that. It was old Mr. Holloway, sweeping the sidewalk outside his hardware store, who said the only thing that stuck with her. He didn't laugh, he didn't smirk, he just looked at her with something closer to caution. "That land's been sittin' empty a long time," he said, eyes narrowing slightly, "longer than folks around here like to talk about. You be careful poking around under that place. Some things get buried for a reason." Then he went back to his sweeping as if he hadn't said anything strange at all. Claire walked the rest of the way to her car, turning his words over like a stone in her palm, wondering what exactly a hardware store owner could know about a house nobody wanted. The cottage smelled like time had forgotten to leave. Damp wood, old ash, a faint mineral scent that reminded Claire of rain on stone. She stood in the doorway with 2 suitcases and a box of David's old tools, listening to the house settle around her like it was exhaling after a long, held breath. Dust hung suspended in the afternoon light, slicing through a cracked window pane. The wallpaper had peeled into long, curling strips, revealing plaster beneath the color of old bone. In the kitchen, a rusted faucet dripped in a rhythm that felt somehow deliberate, like the house itself was counting something. She swept first. It seemed like the only reasonable place to start. Room by room, she pushed years of neglect into corners, uncovering floorboards scarred with water stains and the pale ghost outlines of furniture long gone. It was in the front room that she noticed it, a section of flooring that didn't match the rest. The boards elsewhere ran wide and rough, original to the house by the look of the grain. But here, in a rectangle no larger than a doormat, the wood was narrower, newer, fitted with a precision the rest of the house didn't have. Someone had replaced this section on purpose. She knelt and ran her fingers along the seam, feeling for a reason, and found none. Not yet. Later, exploring the cellar with a flashlight David had once used for camping trips, she noticed the same wrongness in the stone. 3 walls were rough fieldstone, uneven and ancient. The 4th was smoother, newer mortar, a different hand entirely. Claire stood in the cold and the dark, flashlight trembling slightly in her grip, and thought of Mr. Holloway's warning outside the hardware store. Some things get buried for a reason. She didn't know yet what she'd bought for $1, but she was beginning to understand it wasn't nothing. The next morning, Claire returned to the mismatched boards with a crowbar borrowed from Mr. Holloway's shop and a determination she hadn't felt in months. The wood resisted at first, swollen tight with age, but it gave way with a groan that echoed through the empty house. Beneath it lay a thin layer of packed dirt and dust, too even, too deliberate to be decades of natural settling. Someone had filled this space by hand. She dug with a garden trowel, then her fingers, until the trowel struck something that wasn't dirt at all. Metal. She cleared around the edges carefully, her heartbeat picking up pace with every inch revealed, until the shape became unmistakable. An iron hatch, roughly 2 feet square, its surface pitted with rust but its hinges still intact. A heavy ring sat flush in its center, worn smooth by hands that had once gripped it again and again, long before Claire had ever set foot in this house. This wasn't part of the original build. This had been added and hidden after the fact, sealed beneath flooring cut and fitted to match, sealed with a patience that spoke of secrecy rather than simple renovation. Her mind raced through the possibilities, even as her hands stayed still, hovering just above the ring. Old storm shelter, Root cellar, something else entirely. She thought of the cellar wall with its newer mortar, of Mr. Holloway's warning, of the Whitmores' unreadable smiles at the auction. Some things get buried for a reason. Claire wrapped her fingers around the cold iron ring, feeling the decades of dust crack loose beneath her grip. Whatever waited on the other side of this hatch had been hidden by someone who wanted it to stay that way forever. She pulled. The hatch didn't move. Not yet. The hinges had rusted solid, and Claire's arms burned with the effort, before a car door slammed outside, sharp enough to make her drop the ring and scramble to her feet. Through the front window, she watched a silver sedan idle in the gravel drive, and stepping out of it, buttoning his jacket against the wind, was Nathaniel Whitmore. She'd known him only from a distance: town council meetings, ribbon cuttings, his photograph in the local paper more often than most residents saw their own children's school pictures. Up close, his smile looked practiced, the kind worn by men who rarely heard the word no. "Mrs. Bennett," he said, when she opened the door, as though they were old acquaintances. "I'll be direct," he said, glancing past her shoulder into the house with an interest that seemed too careful to be casual. "My family's been looking to expand our holdings along the creek. I understand this property came to you rather, economically. I'd like to offer you $75,000 for it, today if possible." The number landed like a slap. $75,000 for a house that had sold for a single dollar 4 days ago. For a house nobody in town had wanted at all. Claire studied his face, searching for the reason beneath the offer, and found only that same careful smile, unwilling to give anything away. "Why the rush?" she asked. "Let's just say there's value in moving quickly. Properties like this don't stay quiet forever." He left his card on her porch railing and drove away without waiting for an answer, leaving Claire standing in the doorway with the wind pulling at her sleeves and a question circling louder than before. If the house was worthless, why did the wealthiest family in town suddenly want it so badly, and so fast?
Claire didn't call the number on the card. She tore it in half instead, and let the pieces fall into the kitchen trash, then went straight back to the hatch with a resolve that surprised even her. She oiled the hinges with a can of WD-40 she found in David's old toolbox, working the rust loose in patient, careful strokes until the metal finally gave a low groan of surrender. This time, when she pulled, the hatch lifted. Cold air rushed up to meet her, stale, mineral, untouched. A set of narrow stone steps descended into darkness, and Claire hesitated only a moment before switching on her flashlight and starting down. The chamber below was smaller than the cellar above it, maybe 8 feet across, its walls lined with the same rough fieldstone she'd noticed before. But this space had been built with intention, a shelf carved directly into one wall, a small iron strongbox resting on it, and against the far corner a stack of wooden crates gone soft with age, their contents hidden beneath decades of undisturbed dust. Her flashlight beam trembled slightly as she crossed the room. The strongbox wasn't locked. Whoever sealed this chamber hadn't expected anyone to find it at all. Inside she found a leather-bound ledger, its pages brittle and yellowed, filled with handwriting so faded she could only make out fragments. Names, dates, numbers that even at a glance looked like far more money than a small cottage should ever have seen pass through it. Tucked beneath the ledger sat a folded document, its wax seal long since cracked, bearing a name that made her breath catch, a name she recognized from the brass plaque above the hospital's new wing: Whitmore. Claire sat back on her heels in the cold, dust-choked dark, the flashlight beam trembling now for a different reason entirely. Whatever this cottage had been hiding for decades, it was worth far more than $75,000 to the family who wanted it gone. And now she was the only one who knew.
Claire carried the ledger and the sealed document upstairs, into what little daylight still filtered through the cracked front window, and spread them across the kitchen table with hands that wouldn't quite steady. The document's wax seal crumbled at her touch, revealing a land deed dated nearly 70 years earlier. The handwriting was formal, looping, the kind taught in schools that no longer existed. It named the original owner of the land not a Whitmore, but a man named Elias Coburn, and outlined in the dry language of old law a transfer of the property that never should have been legal at all. She read it twice before the meaning settled fully. The land hadn't been sold. It had been seized, signed over under threat of a debt that, according to the ledger's careful columns, had already been paid in full the year before. Someone had buried that payment record along with the deed, hidden the truth in a chamber no one was ever meant to find, and let the Coburn family lose everything on paper, while the Whitmores quietly absorbed land, timber rights, and mineral claims that stretched far beyond this quarter-acre. The ledger told the rest. Names of witnesses who'd signed off on the transfer, most of them men whose surnames Claire recognized from street signs and building plaques around town. Men who'd been paid, in careful, itemized amounts, to look away. Tucked into the ledger's final pages was something else, a photograph, brittle and sepia-toned, of a young woman standing in front of this very cottage, her expression somewhere between defiance and heartbreak. On the back, in the same looping handwriting, someone had written a single line. "They took everything but the truth. I hid that for you." Claire sat in the fading light with the photograph in her hand, understanding now why the floorboards had been cut so precisely, why the mortar in that cellar wall didn't match the rest, why a house worth nothing had been protected so carefully for 70 years. Someone had wanted this found. They just hadn't expected it to take 7 decades or a woman with nothing left to lose. 2 days after Claire found the ledger, a different kind of visit arrived at her door. This time it wasn't Nathaniel Whitmore, smiling and holding out a check. It was a man in a gray suit who introduced himself only as legal counsel for the Whitmore family, holding a folder thick with paperwork and a tone that made it clear the pleasantries were finished. "There's a question of property boundary," he said, without being asked to sit. "A survey error from decades ago. My clients would like to resolve it quietly, before either of us wastes time and money in court." Claire said nothing about the ledger. She simply asked him to leave. He did, but not before letting his eyes drift deliberately toward the cellar door behind her, as though he already knew exactly what she'd found down there. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table with the ledger locked inside an old suitcase, listening to every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the broken window, until sometime past 2 in the morning, she heard something else entirely, the soft, unmistakable scrape of a window being forced from its frame. She grabbed the flashlight and moved through the dark on instinct rather than courage, catching only the shape of a figure retreating through the side yard, boots crunching against gravel, gone before she reached the porch. The window latch on the cellar side had been bent nearly in half. By morning, a letter had appeared in her mailbox, unsigned, typed on plain paper, a warning dressed up as advice, reminding her that small-town courts moved slowly, that legal fees added up quickly, and that a woman in her position couldn't afford a long fight. Claire read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it beside the ledger in the suitcase, evidence stacking upon evidence. They weren't trying to buy the cottage anymore. They were trying to make sure what was buried beneath it stayed buried, by whatever means necessary, and she understood now with a chill settling deep in her chest that she was running out of time to decide who she could trust with the truth.
By sunrise, Claire had made a decision. She couldn't sit alone in that cottage waiting for the next window to be forced open, the next warning left in her mailbox. The truth needed witnesses beyond herself, people the Whitmores couldn't intimidate into silence.
She started with the county records office, a squat brick building she'd passed 100 times without ever stepping inside. The clerk, a woman named Ruth with reading glasses on a beaded chain, listened to Claire's request with polite indifference until she mentioned the name Coburn. Ruth's expression changed. Coburn, she'd repeated slowly. Haven't heard that name in years. There was talk once, long before my time here, about a family that just disappeared from the record books. Nobody ever explained why. Ruth pulled archived files that hadn't been touched in decades, and there, buried in brittle folders, was a second copy of the original deed, water-damaged but legible, confirming everything the ledger had claimed. It wasn't proof enough on its own, but it was a start, and it was outside the cottage now, outside anywhere the Whitmores could quietly make it vanish. From there, Claire drove 2 towns over to the offices of a small newspaper, the Belhaven Ledger, where a young reporter named Sam Alvarez listened to her story with growing disbelief and mounting excitement. Sam had written about local corruption before, always circling but never landing hard evidence. This was different. This had names, dates, signatures. If this checks out, Sam said, already reaching for a recorder, this isn't just a local story, this is generational. Claire made copies of everything, the ledger, the deed, the photograph, and left originals in a safety deposit box under a name that wasn't hers, arranged through a lawyer Ruth recommended, a woman sharp enough to smell a cover-up before Claire finished explaining it. Driving back toward the cottage that evening, headlights cutting through the gathering dark, Claire felt the weight of what she carried settle differently than before. The Whitmores had spent 70 years making sure this truth stayed buried. She had at most days left before they realized it wasn't buried anymore. The story broke on a Thursday morning, splashed across the front page of the Belhaven Ledger beneath a headline that stopped conversations mid-sentence across the entire county. Buried for 70 years. The truth behind the Whitmore fortune. By noon, the story had been picked up by a regional television station. By evening, it had reached beyond the county line entirely, carried by outlets hungry for a story with everything. Old money, buried injustice, a woman who'd bought her way into it for a single dollar. Sam Alvarez had done the work Claire couldn't have done alone, cross-referencing the ledger's names against county archives, tracking down a retired courthouse clerk willing to confirm, on record, that the original debt on the Coburn land had indeed been settled decades before the property was seized. The photograph ran alongside the article, the young woman standing defiant in front of the cottage, finally given a name: Eleanor Coburn. And through the tangled paperwork Claire's lawyer had spent days untangling came the detail that changed everything. Elias Coburn's line hadn't ended with the seizure, as the Whitmores had spent 70 years assuming. It had continued, quietly, through a daughter who'd left town under a different married name, a name that 3 generations later led directly back to David Bennett, Claire's late husband. She wasn't just a woman who'd stumbled onto a stranger's secret. She was, by blood and by law, the rightful heir to land the Whitmores had built an empire upon. Timber rights, mineral claims, acreage that stretched for miles beyond the cottage's quarter acre, all of it resting on a deed that had never been legally theirs to hold. The town that had laughed at her for a dollar house now stared at photographs of her standing on the porch, connected to more wealth and more history than anyone had imagined possible. Nathaniel Whitmore issued no comment. His mother's silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Claire Bennett wasn't the woman people pitied. She was the woman who had uncovered the truth everyone else had spent 70 years trying to forget.
The weeks that followed unraveled the Whitmore name thread by thread. State investigators arrived first, combing through decades of land transactions, timber contracts, and mineral leases that had all quietly traced back to that single fraudulent deed. What had once looked like generational success now read as a carefully maintained house of cards, each subsequent deal resting on the one stolen from Elias Coburn 70 years before. The hospital wing bearing the Whitmore name became a subject of hushed, uncomfortable conversation. The plaque stayed up for now, but no one looked at it the same way anymore. At the diner on Main Street, the same waitresses who'd once laughed over coffee about the Dollar House now went quiet whenever Claire walked in, their eyes dropping to the counter. Denise, who'd once called her decision desperate, left a voicemail Claire didn't return, her voice thick with an apology that came too late to mean much. Mr. Halloway was the only one who met her eyes without flinching. "Told you," he said simply, sweeping his sidewalk as always. "Some things don't stay buried forever." It was the closest thing to pride Claire had seen on anyone's face in months. Margaret Whitmore, once impossible to walk past without an outstretched hand and a warm word, was rarely seen in public at all. When she was, the town watched her differently, not with reverence now, but with the particular quiet judgment small towns reserve for those who'd fooled them the longest. Power, Claire realized, had never really belonged to the Whitmores. It had only ever been borrowed, propped up on a lie old enough that most people had stopped questioning it entirely. Now that the lie had collapsed, so had the illusion of who deserved to be looked up to and who had been laughed at for simply refusing to disappear quietly.
The courtroom was smaller than Claire expected, quiet in a way the past few months had not been. No cameras were allowed inside, though a crowd of reporters waited on the steps outside, and half the town, it seemed, had found a reason to be present. The judge's ruling, when it came, was measured and unhurried, each sentence dismantling 70 years of quiet theft with the same careful precision that had once buried it. The original seizure of the Coburn land was declared unlawful. Ownership of the disputed acreage, timber rights, mineral claims, and all reverted to Claire as Elias Coburn's rightful descendant. The Whitmore family's civil liability came next, restitution calculated across decades of profits drawn from land that was never legally theirs, a sum large enough to make the $75,000 offer for the cottage look, in hindsight, like the desperate lowball it had always been. Separately, the break-in and the anonymous threats found their way back to a private investigator on the Whitmore family's payroll, whose testimony, offered in exchange for leniency, confirmed what Claire had already suspected. Nathaniel Whitmore faced charges of intimidation and evidence tampering, his practiced smile absent from every headline that followed. Outside the courthouse, Claire didn't linger for statements. She walked past the reporters, past the small crowd of familiar faces watching her with expressions she no longer needed to interpret, and drove back toward the cottage alone. The house looked the same as it had the day she'd bought it, broken roof, peeling paint, quietly unremarkable to anyone driving past. But standing on the porch that evening, deed finally, legally, undeniably in her name, Claire understood it had never been about the money at all. It was about being seen, after a lifetime of being overlooked, standing exactly where she belonged.
Spring arrived slowly that year, the way it always did after a long winter, but Claire noticed it more than most. She rebuilt the cottage herself, mostly. A new roof first, then the porch, then the kitchen where she'd once spread a brittle ledger across the table and changed the direction of her entire life. She kept the mismatched floorboards in the front room untouched, sealed now beneath a clear varnish, a quiet reminder of what patience and stubbornness could uncover when everyone else had already looked away. The Coburn name returned to local memory in small, deliberate ways. A plaque, modest compared to the one still bolted above the hospital's east wing, now marked the original boundary line of the land, restored, this time, with the truth attached to it. People in town looked at Claire differently now, though she'd stopped needing them to. The waitresses at the diner greeted her warmly,
Whether from genuine change of heart or simple self-preservation, she no longer cared to guess. Denise had tried, more than once, to rebuild what had frayed between them. Claire let some of it back in slowly, the way you let sunlight back into a room that had been dark too long. On quiet evenings, she sat on the porch she'd rebuilt with her own hands, watching the creek catch the last light of day, and thought about the young woman in that sepia photograph, Eleanor Coburn, who had hidden the truth rather than let it die with her, trusting that someone, someday, would be brave enough or desperate enough to find it. Claire understood now that worth was never something other people got to decide for you. Sometimes it was buried. Sometimes it cost exactly $1. And sometimes all it took was someone willing to dig.